Today's case is fascinating. So fascinating that there are 3 books and a movie written about it. In 1992, a pair of moose hunters came across an old, rusted bus just outside of Denali National Park. What they found inside would tell a tale of a young man's 2-year quest into the wild. The question is this tale a romantic saga about a man on the quest for a peaceful, more authentic life? Or is it the tale of a young man's ignorance as he trekked unprepared into the wild? Hi guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Zara, and on this channel we talk about true crime. So if you're interested, hit the subscribe button to join the fam, and also hit the like button. It really helps out the channel, and share this video if you like, because honestly, if you haven't heard about this case, it's gonna be worth it. Let's get into it. Christopher Johnson McCandless was born on February 12, 1968 in Inglewood, California to his parents, Walter and Wilhelmina Johnson. Wilhelmina was also known as Billy. He had a younger sister named Corinne, and growing up, the two of them were extremely close. So a little bit of backstory about his parents. Originally in the early 1960s, his father, Walt, was married to another woman named Marcia, and Walt at the time was working at Hughes Aircraft, and over here he met Wilhelmina, Billy. She was working as his secretary, and then soon Walt and Billy began an affair. Billy was only 22 years old, and this affair went on for years. At the time, Walt had 2 lives, one with his wife Marcia and their kids, and one with his mistress Billy, who he had also moved in with at that point. He would spend 4 or 5 days with his first family and then disappear for days and then suddenly return. During that time, he was obviously with Billy. His older kids just knew that was just the way their life was with their dad. In 1968, Billy would give birth to their first child, Chris, and this was only 3 months after Marcia had given birth to their 5th child, a boy named Shannon. Then in 1969, Marcia and Walt's 6th child was born, and then finally in 1971, Corinne was born to Billy and Walt. Marcia finally divorced Walt in 1972, and then a few years later, Walt and Billy finally got married. Chris and Corinne grew up knowing their half-siblings and spent time with them on vacations often. In 1976, Walt was offered a job with NASA as an antenna specialist, so they then moved to Virginia, and his mother Billy continued working as a secretary at Hughes Aircraft. Later on, Walt and Billy started a satellite systems consultancy firm, which became very successful in its time. Growing up, Chris and Corinne lived in a nice home in a nice neighborhood and didn't want or need for much. Their family went camping regularly, which Chris really enjoyed. He loved being on an adventure. Chris was the head of his school's track team and a good student with A average grades. He would train with track teammates, taking them on really hard practice runs in places where it was really easy to get lost. But Chris loved it. It was his escape. He saw it as a challenge and saw running as a form of spiritual exercise. Chris also loved reading. In particular, he loved classic literature, and he loved the writer Jack London and was fascinated by his writings and his teachings. Although Chris was a good student, he was very stubborn and very strong-willed. The only subject he didn't do well in was physics, and that was because he refused to write an article in the particular way that the teacher had asked, scoring him an F grade. Chris strived to do well in anything he did, and he rarely complained about things in his life. He kind of saw that as a waste of his time. Chris graduated high school in 1986, and during this time, he fell in love with the topic of apartheid, and this would be what he studied in college at Emory University. While he lived there, he did not have a phone. He stayed in a really small apartment, just a mattress on the floor, and books surrounding him. He worked briefly as a manager at a construction firm and purchased a second-hand yellow Datsun to get him around. During the summer breaks, Chris would remain distant with his sister Corinne due to him traveling to so many different places, being the adventurer that he was. And he rarely contacted his parents and would mainly write to Corinne through letters and postcards. He would arrive back to college 2 days before classes would start, and he was scruffy looking, but he went on to get excellent grades. He graduated from Emory University in May 1990 with a degree in anthropology, but saw titles and honors as really irrelevant. He celebrated his graduation at a dinner with his parents and Corinne on 12th May 1990, but Chris had never wanted material things and he didn't believe in having a career. Instead, he longed for adventure and an escape. Chris felt this way due to his past. He used running as a form of therapy, as an escape from the troubles in his life. His family may have been one of the bigger evils that he was trying to run away from. His sister Corinne later revealed in a book that the two of them and their mother Billy suffered great abuse at the hands of their father Walt. According to Corinne, their father had multiple angry outbursts, drunken rages, and was verbally abusive. During these outbursts, he would beat Chris and Corinne, sometimes at the same time, over his lap. Corinne would look up at her dad in search of some leniency, only to see the sadistic look of almost pleasure her dad had on his face, similar to that of a drug addict in the peak of his high. During this time, Billy had promised the kids that she would leave Walt, take the children away from his abusive ways and behavior, but she never followed through. This also made Chris lose faith in his mother and drove him away from her, that she didn't do anything to protect her children. Walt would also allegedly attack Billy in front of the kids, and this allegedly made Chris have no respect for his father. And their home life was the reason why Chris and Corinne grew so close to each other. They sought comfort in each other. They protected each other and were all each other had. However, Corinne also does state that despite the bad times, there were good times. They grew up with a roof over their heads in a nice home and had many camping trips and adventures with the family. Despite the bad memories, they also had many happy memories. These camping trips also sparked Chris's love for the outdoors and alleviated any stress that troubled him at home. Corinne and Chris were thankful for the good times and acknowledged that their parents did play a part in those happy times. It's also important to note that Walt and Billy have disputed and obviously denied any of these abuse allegations. Later on, after graduating high school, Chris had traveled across California to meet some family members. While he was there, he found out that his father had been in a separate marriage with an entire family at the time his mother conceived him and Corinne. This is something that infuriated him to the point where he thought his entire life had been a lie. This was when he cut ties and communication with his own parents. He felt his entire life was meaningless because his parents had lied to him all this time. Around this time, I believe due to Chris not having any contact with his parents, they offered to buy him a brand new car and said that he could use the money left in his education fund to pay for graduate school. I believe Corinne had told him about this offer instead of his parents directly telling him. And Chris, instead of being happy about this offer, as one would kind of expect, Chris was angry. He was angry at his parents' gesture, believing they were trying to gain his respect and trust through materialistic things. He felt insulted. He was happy with his, secondhand yellow Datsun, and he didn't see any problem with the car. He thought his parents knew him better than that. So instead, he lectured Corinne about their foolishness with materialism. So Chris decided to do something about it. This would be the last time Corinne would hear from Chris. Soon after graduation on 15th May 1990, he gathered his remaining money from his education fund and donated a total of $24,000 to Oxfam, which is a charity that fights hunger. And he did this without telling his parents. It's a lot of money back then. It would be like donating $60,000 today. That's a lot of money. And this fits well within Chris's character as described by his own father, that Chris really cared about the less fortunate. In high school, he gave homeless people meals, and on one occasion, he brought a total stranger into his home to stay in the family's Airstream trailer. And he did this again without telling anyone in his family. But he was trying to help. Following his graduation, Chris lived a really random life, working in a restaurant and as a farmhand whenever he needed money. Then in June 1990, Chris set off in his yellow Datsun in an apparent cross-country trip to California. However, his car was not in the best condition and suffered numerous breakdowns along the way. He also had no car insurance and was driving with expired license plates. By July 10th, 1990, Chris arrived in Arizona, but a flash flood soaked the engine of his car and it would no longer start. So he had no choice but to abandon his car. But he did leave a note saying that if someone could get the car out, they could have it. He removed the car's license plates and buried it along with his rifle that he carried. He then gathered the remainder of his cash, which was around $120, and he set it on fire. Yeah, set it on fire. He took whatever belongings he could carry in his backpack and continued along by foot. Along with his car, Chris also left most of his belongings behind. I believe the reason for burying his license plates was so that he couldn't get a ticket, and then I guess his parents would find out where his car was, hence finding out his location, because all of that mail would go back to his parents' house. Now, I don't know about you guys, but just the way that he abandoned everything, like he just left his car, carried whatever belongings by foot in a backpack, like to me, that is like, no, not gonna do that. I mean, look at me. Do you really think I'm gonna survive in the wild? Like, no. But Chris, you know what? He liked a challenge. He was going to travel with the least amount of belongings as possible and as little money as possible. Like, that's really a challenge. He also had no map and no plans, just the need for adventure. And I want to know right here if any of you guys are like this, because this is fascinating to me. This entire story is so fascinating that there are people like this. So if you're someone who could do this, comment below, let me know. At this point, after not hearing back from their son, Walt and Billy decided to travel to Atlanta to the university to check on him. And when they arrived at his home, they found it empty with a for rent sign taped to the door. Chris had left at this point weeks prior without a word to his parents. Walt and Billy began to worry and decided to actually go and search for him to make sure that, he was safe. Corinne, despite being close to Chris, also had no idea where Chris was or what his plans even were. In October 1990, so August, September, 3 months after he abandoned his car, a National Park Service ranger found a yellow Datsun in a dry riverbed in Lake Mead National Park. A note on the car said that it's abandoned and it's free for the taking. Inside the car, there was some clothing, a guitar, and 2 big bags of rice. The car was later put into service as an undercover vehicle for the local police department. And Walt and Billy then received a ticket for the Datsun from California. And then they hire a private investigator who informed them, right, that Chris had donated his college fund money to charity. They were so shocked by this. I mean, that was supposed to be for his education. And I believe they tried to track him down everywhere, including Europe and South America. And at this point, they were really worried now because they realized Chris was trying not to be found. Chris continued along his journey using various methods of transport, including trains, canoeing, and walking. He now went by the name Alexander Supertramp, the name from the book The Autobiography of a Supertramp by William H. Davies from 1908. In August 1990, he began keeping a journal documenting his travels and experiences along the way. When asked by people where his family was, he would reply that he didn't have a family anymore. So Chris continued heading west, and it is suspected he broke into some cabins in the Sierra Nevada region to steal food, clothes, supplies, etc. But there was only one case that was ever confirmed to have really been him, as there were a few break-ins in that general area. Chris never used his real name during this period. He only went by Alex, but I will keep referring to him as Chris just to keep it less confusing. On August 15th, 1990, Chris was sitting on the side of a highway reading a book. Jan Burris and her boyfriend Bob were driving past and they saw Chris. She thought Chris reminded her of her own son, who was around the same age at the time, but who hadn't spoken to her in years. Jan and Bob lived just like Chris, except they had a car. So they offered Chris a ride and ended up camping with him for a week at Oric Beach. Jan would later say that Chris wasn't a very good hitchhiker. Like, he was standing there, but he wasn't even asking anyone for a ride. He was just sitting there reading his book. And she was like, you're never going to get a ride sitting there like that on the side of the road. So she thought that was really funny. Jan and Bob also said that Chris was a very good kid. He was very excited about his adventure alone and proud of himself for surviving on plants that he learned about from his books. However, he would often reject Jan's advice as he didn't want to be parented. He constantly talked about his great Alaskan odyssey, and Chris grew very close to Jan in their short time together. And after he left, he sent her postcards every month or so from different locations for the next 2 years. So now let's talk about the different people that Chris encountered along his journey. On September 1st, 1990, Chris hitchhikes a ride from a man named Wayne Westerberg in South Dakota. And Wayne stated that Chris asked to be dropped to Saco Hot Springs. And Wayne agreed, but only to drive him 10 miles down the road. But first, he needed to drop off a package to a friend's place. And while they were at the friend's place, the friend offered them both beers. And then Chris said that he was so hungry. They asked him, how long has it been since you've had a meal? And he said, 2 days. So the friend's wife was like, no, I'm going to make you a nice hot meal. She served it up to Chris, and he ate so much that he ended up falling asleep at the table. By the time Wayne went to go and drop Chris off to the location that they agreed on, it was around 10:30 p.m. and it was pouring rain. Wayne was like, are you sure you want to be dropped off here? I mean, it's late. It's time for bed. Essentially, it's pouring rain and you have no shelter. Do you want to just come back with me? Wayne owned a grain elevator in Carthage, South Dakota. So he offered Chris, a place to stay for the night and a job in the future if he needed it. So Chris stayed the night, but then he left the following morning. But then a couple of weeks later, Chris reached out to Wayne and took him up on the job offer. Wayne said that Chris was the hardest worker he had ever seen and did all of the jobs that no one else wanted to do. He never had a problem with hard work. So Chris stays with Wayne until Wayne gets in trouble with the law. Wayne is arrested by the FBI for selling black boxes that basically allow you to watch cable TV illegally, right? And he goes to prison for 4 months. With Wayne gone, Chris decides to now leave South Dakota on October 23rd, 1990, to now travel on to Mexico. Wayne ended up becoming one of Chris's closest friends along the way due to the kindness that he showed him. He kept in touch with Wayne regularly. On October 28th, Chris hitches a ride into Needles, California, and in his journal he wrote, "Overjoyed upon reaching the Colorado River." Then he left the highway and started walking south through the desert, following the riverbank to the Californian border. So over here, he sees a second-hand aluminium canoe for sale, and he decides to buy it and paddle it down the Colorado River to the Gulf of California, nearly 400 miles or 640 kilometers to the south, across the border to Mexico. Honestly, I don't know how he did this. His initial adventure is scary enough to me, but now he's like, oh yeah, I'll just paddle my way through the treacherous rivers for hundreds of miles. No big deal. No big deal. He would stop along towns and collect more supplies as needed. And this is just mind-blowing to me. Something I could never, ever, ever, ever do. If I had to survive this, I would not survive. So then finally on December 2nd, yes, December 2nd, that's over 4 weeks of traveling by this freaking canoe, he reaches the Mexican border. He had no ID, so he was worried about being caught at the border, but luckily he was somehow able to sneak across the border. And he then tried to paddle to the Gulf Coast, but the coast was blocked by swamps, and at this point he was actually lost. He spent 3 days walking his canoe across to another canal. And over here, he luckily meets some Mexican duck hunters, and they offer to give him and his canoe a ride to the coast in the back of their truck. Honestly, it's a miracle. I don't know what he would have done if he didn't meet these guys. And where they dropped him off, he ended up spending a really long time in this area. He set up camp, exploring all of the places in the area. And he even celebrated the new year here and spoke to no one in 36 days. He survived on a 5-pound bag of rice and whatever seafood he could find in the area. However, on January 11th, 1991, after a particularly rough patch of water where one of his oars broke, Chris abandons his canoe and tries to return to America. On January 16th, 1991, Chris is caught by immigration police at the border trying to sneak back in without ID, and he is held in jail overnight. He somehow explains to the police what his situation is, and they eventually let him into America, although they take away the .38 caliber gun that he had with him. Now, this is also wild. I mean, he was trying to sneak over the border. I'm surprised that the police just kind of like, okay, go away. Things would have probably been very different for him if he was apprehended. He wasn't a criminal, but, they need to verify who he was through paperwork and things like that. So if he was sort of caught and brought back to a town or something like that, I'm guessing that his parents would have been notified through this private investigator, and things would have just gone very differently for Chris at this point. But somehow he seemed to always make his way on his own. After they released him, Chris then traveled city to city bearing his money, whatever money he had, underground so he wouldn't get robbed, as he slept under highways and bridges. And on February 9th, 1991, he wrote this in his journal: "Can this be the same Alex that set out in July 1990? Malnutrition and the road have taken their toll on this body. Over 25 pounds lost, but his spirit is soaring." It's wild that he even referred to himself as Alex instead of Chris in his own writings. On February 24th, 7.5 months after he abandoned his yellow Datsun, Chris returned to the spot where he left it and dug up his license plates and other belongings, and then hitchhiked to Las Vegas, where he got a job. On May 1st, 1991, he left Vegas and arrived in Bullhead City, Arizona, where he settled down again in an abandoned trailer, and he worked at McDonald's. He stayed there for a couple of months, and strangely, he worked under his real name, Chris McCandless, even opened a savings account, and gave out his real social security number. So he stayed here for a while because in late November 1991, Jan received a postcard from Chris and she was so happy to hear from him. She quickly wrote back that she could come and visit him as he wasn't too far away from her. Chris was so happy also to hear back from Jan and wrote back to her on December 9th, 1991, writing, "I'm so glad to find you both alive and sound. Thanks so much for the Christmas card. It's nice to be thought of this time of year. I'm so excited to hear that you will be coming to see me. You're welcome anytime. It's really great to think that after almost a year and a half, we shall be meeting again." 4 days after receiving this reply from Chris, as Jan and Bob, they were packing up to drive to Chris, they saw this big backpack leaning up against their van. It was Chris's. They were so happy to see Alex, and he told them he was tired of working at McDonald's and he wanted to just get out of there. Jan had a bookstall at a local flea market, and Chris offered to help out there for a while before deciding to finally leave on his adventure again. From Jan 1st, 1992 till March, Chris stayed with an 83-year-old man named Ronald Franz. And Ronald taught Chris many things along the way. Ronald was a devout Christian and had spent most of his adult life in the army. On New Year's Eve 1957, while Ron was overseas, his wife and only child were killed by a drunk driver in a car accident. And he spent many years looking after random kids, but when he met Chris, he liked him instantly. During this time, whatever Chris was doing, whoever he met, he was basically just biding his time until spring, when he planned to fulfill his dream, the Great Alaskan Adventure. And he would tell this dream and plan to those that he met along the way. Chris then decided to go back to Wayne in South Dakota and work for him to earn money to buy supplies for his Alaskan adventure. He had been spending a lot of time with Ron at this point, and Ron agreed to drive him to Colorado, which was a 12-hour journey, and he left him with a machete, an Arctic parka, a collapsible fishing pole, and some other gear. And honestly, the people that Chris met along the way are some dope-ass people. I know Ron was perhaps lonely, he was older, and he didn't have much to do, but to drive someone 12 hours away after spending some weeks together, to feed them, to give them a place to stay, honestly, it's awesome. Later on, Ron was interviewed and he stated that before he dropped Chris off, he told him about his life, and he stated, "My mother was an only child, so was my father, and I was their only child. Now that my boy is dead, I'm at the end of the line. When I'm gone, my family will be finished, gone forever." So I asked Alex if I could adopt him, if he would be my grandson. Ugh, this breaks my heart. And Chris at the time was weirded out by the request, but told him that, Ron, I'll talk to you once I come back from Alaska. That's why I feel like Ron was pretty lonely, and spending those few weeks with Chris, Alex, just made him feel some type of way to be with a person that was so intelligent and adventurous. It kind of gave Ron a sense of excitement and life. So once Ron dropped him off, Chris arrived back at Wayne's place and worked for Wayne for a few weeks. And Wayne at this point also discovered Alex's real name on some tax forms, but he never pushed or questioned him about his journey, and that's why they remained so close. He never pried into Chris's life. Finally, the time was here. It was time for Chris to set off on his Great Alaskan Adventure. On April 25th, 1991, after a very difficult journey, Chris made it to Fairbanks, Alaska, and stayed near the University of Alaska. He sent 2 postcards from the university post office, one to Jan and one to Wayne. On April 27th, 1992, Wayne received this postcard from Chris stating, "Greetings from Fairbanks. This is the last you shall hear from me, Wayne. Arrived here 2 days ago. It was very difficult to catch rides in the Yukon Territory, but I finally got here. Please return all mail I receive to the sender. It might be a very long time before I return south. If this adventure proves fatal and you don't ever hear from me again, I want you to know you're a great man. I now walk into the wild. Alex." On Tuesday, April 28th, a truck driver named Jim Gallion stops for Chris, who introduces himself as Alex. He asks him for a ride to Denali National Park. Denali is honestly one of the most striking features on the entire planet. At 20,310 feet, it is the highest mountain on the continent. It is a huge, unspoiled wilderness park with lots of glacial rivers, massive peaks, and lots of wildlife. There's moose, caribou, sheep, grizzly bears, wolves in that park. Just chilling. Chris tells Jim that he wants to walk deep into the bush and live off the land for a few months. At first, Jim's like, ¿Qué pasa? Chris is just another delusional visitor to the Alaskan frontier. But as he rides in the car with him for 2 hours, he realized that Chris was actually extremely intelligent. However, he does tell Chris, "You know what, man? You are unprepared for this journey." He sees that he has the bare necessities, being a 10-pound bag of rice, his hiking boots, which were not weatherproof or insulated, and his rifle with 400 rounds of hollow point ammunition, which would be too small for the large animals and game he would have to kill in order to survive. This stuff was just not enough. So I know nothing about guns, and 400 rounds of ammunition sounds like a lot to me, but I looked it up and apparently the box is only like that big. So there were really small bullets, and that much ammunition, is not really a lot for months in the wilderness. He didn't have any other food, no axe, no compass, no snowshoes. And the only map he had was the one he got from a gas station. Jim was seriously concerned about Chris's safety and lack of equipment and experience. And he tried to convince Chris to delay his trip and even offered to drive him somewhere else to get stocked up on suitable supplies and equipment. Jim even tried to scare him with stories of bear attacks and starvation. But Chris had an answer for everything. We all know Chris by now. He declined any help, and Jim said there was no talking Chris out of his plans. Before he left, Chris insisted on giving Jim his watch, his comb, and what he said was all of his money, which was around 85 cents. Jim refused, but Chris said he was going to throw it away if he didn't take it. Before he left, Jim gave Chris an old pair of rubber work boots and a slip of paper with his phone number on it. Jim said, "If you make it out alive, give me a call and I'll tell you how to get the boots back to me." He also gave Chris 2 grilled cheese and tuna sandwiches and a bag of corn chips. Jim then took a picture of Alex holding his rifle at the trailhead. Then, with a huge smile, Chris disappeared down the snow-covered track. Now, as Jim drove away, he thought about telling authorities about Alex's plan, but he said, "I figured he was going to be okay. I thought he'd probably just get hungry really quickly and then just walk out to the highway. That's what any normal person would do." That was the last time anybody saw Alex Supertramp alive. If you're wondering what Chris's reasons were for having this dream of a great Alaskan adventure, well, it was because he wanted to live a free life, a challenge that would push him to his limits. He had already, by this point, survived near death on many occasions, and this probably just gave him the confidence to venture into the Alaskan wild. However, this was different. Chris really underestimated the harshness of the area he was in, how unforgiving the woodlands were, and how unequipped he really was. But this was done by choice. In Chris's eyes, early explorers of the wild were not equipped with a map or a tent or food supplies. They lived off the land, and that's exactly what he planned to do. He planned to head west until he hit the Bering Sea. During this time hiking in the Denali National Park, Chris kept a daily diary marking every single day of his 113 days there. On his 4th day, Chris came upon an abandoned bus. In 1961, during construction taking place in the area, 3 of these buses were brought in to house the construction workers. They were fitted with bunks and a simple stove. And the construction then happened to be halted a couple of years later, and 2 of the buses were able to be taken back to the highway. However, the 3rd bus was left about halfway out the trail to serve as backcountry shelter for hunters and trappers. The bus was once part of the Fairbanks City Transit System and was called Bus 142. Like I said, Chris kept a daily journal of his time in the wild. He wrote many notes on several books and inside the bus too, and he took many photos along the way. He called day 4 the Magic Bus Day. By day 9, he wrote weakness. It seemed like the Alaskan woods were way too thick and way too dangerous to carry on to the Bering Sea, so Chris set up camp inside the Magic Bus. His diet consisted of small animals he could hunt like squirrels, porcupines, ducks, and other birds, and he also foraged for berries and other edible plants. However, it did seem like the first few days of Chris's Alaskan journey were going well. The photos Chris took shows him smiling and proud of his achievements. On day 43, Chris writes moose. And in the writing alone, along with the photos, it seems he was very happy with this. Chris was advised by people that he met along his travels on how to preserve meats. So he was aware he had to build a smoker underground to keep the moose meat safe. However, it took him 4 days to butcher the animal. On the 5th day, he wrote, day 48, maggots already. Smoking appears ineffective. Don't know. Looks like disaster. I now wish I had never shot the moose. One of the greatest tragedies of my life. Chris didn't know how to properly store the animal meat, and most of it went to waste. Also, many people call Chris dumb for thinking he killed a moose since it is such a large animal, and they believe that his rifle, the ammunition, couldn't kill such a large animal, so they theorized that what he actually killed was a caribou. But to be honest, they kind of look the same to me. And hey, the guy was barely eating. He was probably low on energy. Give him a break. By day 69, it looked like Chris had had enough and wanted to head on back into civilization. So on his way down the Stampede Trail where he initially arrived, he came across the Teklanika River. And during this time in early May 1992, the river was very shallow and he was able to wade across it to the other side, find the magic bus, set up camp, etc. But on day 69, when he attempted to hike back the way he came, the river was now extremely swollen with rapid waters due to the late spring snow melting. Waters that were way too dangerous to cross, and Chris was shattered. He wrote, day 69, rained in. River looks impossible. Lonely, scared. Unfortunately for Chris, this was where his lack of preparation failed him for the final time. You see, if Chris just knew more about the area or carried a real map with him, he would have known that to the east is the George Parks Highway, the main road between Anchorage and Fairbanks, and then to the south was the Denali National Park shuttle system, which is full of tourists most days. A road also crosses the same river on a big bridge, which would have been probably a couple of days worth of hiking away. Then the worst part for me, just a half mile down the river was a cable basket that would have easily taken him across the river. Chris, thinking he was trapped, just returned to the bus. The next couple of months went as follows. So day 78, missed wolf. 8 potato seeds and many berries coming. Day 94, woodpecker, fog, extremely weak. Fault of potato seed. Much trouble just to stand up. Starving, great jeopardy. Day 100, death looms a serious threat. Too weak to walk out, have literally become trapped in wild. No game. Days 100 to 103 were no written entries, just slashes next to it, which many assume was days that he did not eat. Day 107, beautiful berries. This was the last time he wrote a description of his day. Sometime in August, he posted an SOS note on the bus stating, "Attention possible visitors, SOS, I need your help. I am injured, near death, and too weak to hike out. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you, Chris McCandless." August and a question mark. This time, he did not call himself Alexander Supertramp. He was Chris McCandless once again. He then took one final photo. In this photo, he is smiling. He looks peaceful and is waving. He's holding a note that says, "I have had a happy life and thank the Lord. Goodbye and may God bless all." Days 108 to 113 were again only marked with slashes indicating that he perhaps did not eat. And in this photo, he has a genuine, serene smile. On September 6th, 1992, a group of hunters who were looking for shelter for the night came upon the magic bus. They entered the bus hoping to set up for the night when they smelled what they believed to be rotting food. As they inspected the bus, they discovered a lump in a sleeping bag in the back of the bus. The police were notified and they arrived the following day. Here in his final resting place, they found Chris in a sleeping bag. He was frail, thin, and frozen. He weighed only 67 pounds or 30 kilos. It is believed that he died from a mixture of starvation and poisoning by the potato seeds in late August 1992. The wild thing is, even after his death, some of the people he befriended along the way still played a part in his life. Wayne Westerberg found out about Chris's death through a truck driver who heard about the unidentified man found dead on a bus. He thought that this man sounded a lot like Alex Supertramp and helped the police identify him through his social security number that he had with him. One thing to note that I found interesting was that Chris's backpack was later found by a man named Will Forsberg, who later found Chris's multiple IDs inside a hidden pocket. Also, Chris wrote his name on multiple notes around the bus, so it's weird that the police could not ID him immediately. And his parents and sister were then notified of his death after his body had been identified by Wayne. And if you're questioning the fact that he had these IDs with him and he didn't have it at the Mexican border, I believe when he came back into America and he dug up his license plate and things like that, he collected his IDs and stuff too. Before Chris left Ronald France, he told him that, "Ronald, you should actually start living your life." So Ron did just that. He went out on the road like Chris and had some adventures, but for many years he parked his trailer in an area that Chris had told him he was familiar with, waiting for his friend to one day return. When he learned of Chris's death, he became an atheist because he said no God would let a man like Chris die that young. So that is the incredible story of Christopher McCandless. People's opinions on his life are quite divided. Some think he is somewhat of a legend, while others think he was just plain stupid to go out into the wild unprepared, without a map, without studied knowledge of the area. That Chris was not an adventurer. He was just someone who thought, he could do whatever he wanted and get by. But hey, he kind of did, didn't he? Until his death. I am on the other side, I think. While many things he did were deemed stupid and unprepared, I really think that his mind was on another level. Again, this is just my opinion based on the information available out there, but I think that he was a really intelligent guy, but his head was in a different dimension. He didn't value the important things in life like money, fame, possessions, He really valued life and wanted to live, experiencing things that you wouldn't get to by just working, a 9 to 5 and coming home each night. He wanted more. And I believe that. I actually admire him. Sometimes I also believe that a simple life would really be the best, living on a farm, working for yourself, doing real hard work. And that doesn't diminish other types of work. I mean, a lot of things can be hard work, even if they aren't physical labor. But there's just something about living on the land, going back to nature, that's appealing. In today's times, we are so far from our origin. We don't eat real food anymore. We don't hunt and gather. We don't build things. Obviously, that was hard back in the day. And while that isn't ideal, some, happy medium might be. If Chris was trying to escape from a privileged life, I guess, in the 90s, in the late 80s, can you imagine what he would think of our world today? What it's become? I think he was searching for the purpose in his life. It's believed that he had possibly been celibate. Girls had been interested in him at times, and maybe he felt the same, but it's never believed he pursued that part of life. It was always about his great adventure. And a great adventure was had. I'm fascinated by everything he did. He survived many tough situations, and hopefully he was truly happy when he died, like that photo and note suggests. I also want to mention the many kind people he met along the way. Ron, Jim, Wayne, and Jan. I mean, you would think that he would meet people who wanted to harm him. He was by himself an easy target, but no, the people he met along the way were also incredible. They helped a complete stranger and made a lasting impression on Chris, as did he on them. Bus 142 became his memorial for a while and a tourist attraction because many people from all over would hike the Stampede Trail just to follow in Chris's footsteps. But a couple of people also met his same fate when they drowned in the river that trapped him. So eventually the police just removed the bus from the area to just prevent people from continuing to risk their lives to be like Chris. John Craker did an article on Chris in January 1993 and later wrote the book called Into the Wild, which in 2007 became the movie Into the Wild by Sean Penn. If you enjoyed his story, I highly recommend you watch that movie. It kind of puts everything, kind of gives like a, what does a movie do? It gives like a visual to everything I'm talking about. Chris's adventure has caused many different debates on how to be safe in the wild and what not to do. And many have said that what he did amounted to suicide, but that's not also accurate because he did ask for help and he wanted to live through that note that he stuck on his bus. But he's also had a lot of praise for his courage and spirit of adventure. Many have also said that the reason for him wanting to escape and live this free life was sad because he was trying to escape something that he felt was bad, like his you know, dad's alleged abuse and the fact that he felt that his life was a lie. But I feel that even if he didn't have those things, he seemed like the kind of person who was just a little bit above us all, like I say, in a different dimension. Not that he was better than anyone, just that he had a different plan for his life. And I absolutely love Chris's story and adventures, and I just wish it had a happy ending. Let me know your thoughts about Chris's story down below. I'm sure some of you know the story, so I would love to know your thoughts in the comments, and I can't wait to chat with you down there. See you in next week's video, guys. Besitos. Bye.